you can't describe LSD unless you've taken it. You can't understand it, and nothing you've read, nothing you've seen on television. You have to take it and you have to experience it. Cocaine is more or less what you expect. It is confidence up to 100. It is a very intense feeling. Everything feels amazing.
I'm Tim Bickett, a grain and cattle risk management advisor from Worthington, Minnesota, and you are listening to the Vance Crowe podcast.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm glad you're here. Today we have an interview with a longtime friend of mine named Buck Mulligan, who I actually didn't know was writing a book. It's called Adventures on Drugs, and it is a very different sort of book. I've actually never met anybody that decided that they were going to not do any sort of drugs or alcohol their whole life, and then decided that they would try a whole bunch of different drugs while traveling around the world in the place where those drugs are kind of endemic in that part of society. Buck is a character, and he is from Ireland with this kind of deep voice and accent, and he's a lot of fun. I have to say, this podcast, it gets a little explicit. Of course, we talk about drugs and drug usage, and Buck isn't saying, don't anybody ever do drugs. He has a very moderated approach, but then we also end up talking about sex and different mores and traditions around that. So if you have young people around and you don't want to have the embarrassed look on your faces as you hear awkward things talked about, then you may want to flip this one off. There's nothing too explicit, but we definitely reference what's going on there and not a lot held back. So this is a very interesting interview. So one of the things that I'm always talking to you about is joining the Articulate Ventures Network. And I think that this has been a group that has grown and transformed over time to be something that is so far beyond what I imagined it would be that it's oftentimes hard for me to explain to listeners. But if you're a listener and you've been tuning in all the time and you're wondering, is this the type of thing for me? Then I would say you ought to think about dipping your toe in. You can just join for a month or you can join for an entire year. But if you do join, you'll get access to some of the cool amateur skills nights classes that we've been putting together. What we do is when somebody from the network has a skill that they developed because they loved something, then we give them a chance to give a 1-hour talk on that. And these talks so far have been incredible. We've had a scientist sit down and explain to us how to do shortwave radio, both for just listening in on conversations from all over the world, but also how would you go about getting a license so you could be a ham radio operator. We've had two brothers get on, the Ring brothers, and explain how is it that you would butcher a cow? How do you slaughter it? How do you skin it? What do you do? What are all the cuts? And they have actual photographs and videos of them doing it. And for me, I've eaten a lot of beef in my life, but I've never actually seen it up close and personal. We've had a police officer talk about how to handle yourself in chaotic situations. And next month, we're going to have a woman on that is an expert in light. And she's going to talk with us all about gardening, how to pick out what seeds are right for your garden, how to pick out where to put this garden in your yard, and all of the things about gardening that if you've never been a gardener, you would want to know. And we're trying to get this done in time for spring planting. These are just a few of the things that we do in the Articulate Ventures Network. We're always trying experiments. We're allowing people to run groups. We get people together to practice their speaking. It is an exceptional online community, and we would love, love, love if a listener of the podcast like you joined. Every single person in that network had to make that choice where they were going to say, I'm going to go explore something new, and I hope you will build up the courage to try it, join. People love it, and almost every single person that's joined has stayed with us, and I think you will too. All right, so without further ado, if you'd like to join the Articulate Ventures Network, go to network.articulate.ventures, and I'll have the link below. Also in the link below, we have started creating a pattern language merchandise store. So there are people that were asking me for mugs and shirts and things like that. It came from the network, but we want to open it up to podcast listeners. So if you go to the link below, you can find a place to buy some pretty cool shirts and mugs and support the podcast along the way. This is a blast for me. I hope you guys are having fun. And now on to our interview with my man, Buck Mulligan. Buck Mulligan, welcome to the podcast.
Vance Crowe, thank you for having me.
Hey, it's good to see you, man. You know, the first time I ever saw you, we were on the League of Nerds podcast. You were a co-host, and that was the first podcast I'd ever done. So I'm proud to now be hosting my own podcast and having you on because you are now the author of a brand new book called Adventures on Drugs. What is that book about?
A few years ago now, went through a breakup and sitting down writing. I was thinking about things I could do, or things to keep your mind occupied and out of the ether, where everything sort of comes out of. I got this idea for a book called Adventures in Drugland, and I'd go and I'd talk about drugs, and I'd maybe go meet some cartel people or do something like this here, but then the name Adventures on Drugs sort of popped into my head. Now, I'm teetotal, so I had spent most of my life never even drank alcohol. I thought it would be an interesting thing to do, where if I went to the 6 countries most associated with particular drugs and try those drugs for the first time for the purposes of the book. And so that's what I did. I went to Colombia, and done what you'd expect. I went to Oktoberfest, got drunk there, and went to Stonehenge and for winter solstice and tried magic mushrooms, to name half of them. And so just sort of set out, talk mainly about just interesting things that I've found along the way. It's also a travel book, so I talk about where I'm staying and the people I've met and the science and some of the politics and history and the culture and philosophy around drugs. So just sort of like it's a travel book mainly, but it's I think it's interesting. Got some reasonable
Buck,
reviews.
Do you not have a mother? I mean, were you not worried about, I'm going to write this book of me doing, illicit activities and my mother is going to, heap shame upon me?
I think I actually mentioned my mother. My dedication there at the start, which you'll not be fit to see, reads to my parents, who I hope never read this. It's maybe one of these things that maybe you don't bother discussing with my parents. So it's I think I've often enjoyed like traveling to places that's. I was talking today about, I was in Beirut a few years ago, and so when I went to Beirut, I just mentioned I was going somewhere warm. I didn't mention where I was going. So I don't rock the boat in that sense.
When you were doing the opening, you used a word that I think I've heard in passing, maybe in old-timey movies, but I never actually heard anybody refer to themselves as a teetotaler. Is that like a common phrase, or is that an actual thing that you were?
No, all right. Well, so what I was a pioneer. So in the late 1800s, which I need to fix in the fucking book, put this wrong. A movement. So there was all across the Western world became teetotaler movements. Basically, people were staying dry. So the Prohibition era was sort of born out of it as well. But just groups started saying, okay, now we're going to abstain from alcohol and any mind-altering substances. But the idea really took off in Ireland in the 1900s, and a movement called the Pioneers started, where these people were staunchly opposed to taking any alcohol, and born out of what you would expect. So it was born out of, firstly as well, out of the sort of the growth of like nationalism and this idea of like the Irish identity. And since Irish people there's sort of a popular quote in Chicago where a teacher asked a student, "What do you know about the Irish?" And the student replies, "Well, they wear green and they live on whiskey." So like, and so it's like, oh, this is, and to people, people would have cringed at this idea. This is just what the Irish were known for, as being drunkards and all the rest. And they're in the 1900s, a very poor country, so the effects of alcohol would cause there too. So you have Father Colin began the Pioneers. So you were given a pin with the Sacred Heart on it, and you've made a pledge, say, "I'm going to abstain from alcohol completely." My grandfather was one, my father was one, and then I ended up taking the pledge as well. It's fairly common, like in Catholic areas, to when you take your confirmation, that you take your pledge as well, but you take it till the age of 18. But then I took it then afterwards. So I'd never tasted, never took any alcohol. I think it was until this, right about the first occasion in the book, in doing that there. So that's where that came out of. But the term teetotal is older again. It came from I think a 17th century monk who had a stutter. So he was saying he was totally totally, going for total absence of alcohol, not just temporary, small amounts. So he says total, and then it bled out of that there, and memed in the way that words often do.
So when you decided to take this plunge, I feel like this is a little bit like virginity, right? Like you don't get to go back afterwards.
Yeah.
So which was the first drug that you did, and like how did you, was that a scary experience?
Well, the first drug in the book, because I sort of like touch and everything, because the first thing is just sort of in and around this time where I have the drag of a joint and things like this here, but the first drug I do for the book is cocaine. So often, so it's fairly serious in the deep end, and I find myself, because it's funny because I went to Colombia. The chance had come up a couple of times. I was there for a couple of weeks, because it's all over Colombia, funny enough. And I just kept panicking and then not doing it. And like, oh, okay, somebody'd offer me, and I'd go, oh, okay. I get to Medellin and say, okay, I'm definitely going to do it here because it's home of Pablo Escobar. Go visit his grave. It's popular for people to do. From what I understand, the top of his grave is sprayed down with WD-40 to stop people from doing lines of cocaine off it. So I said that night I would do it in Medellin, but I got out, but there's like extreme poverty there. So and I decided to stay just on the outskirts of the city center. And so it's like Night of the Living Dead, where there's people who are like, at this point, like, you've been in a slum before, so like people barely recognizable as people, and screaming at one another and shouting, and life for everybody else just going on as normal. Shops working away, a mechanic working away, children going to school, but just walking in amongst around them, just these people, like just something out of a horror movie. And I went out that night, and this is what was surrounding me. And I went, and again, just had an awful amount of fear in me. And I went, no, I'm not going to do this, because for my silly little book talking about drugs. And I was sitting outside the hostel, with people shooting up just on the doorstep. One man, just looking in between his toes to try to find somewhere to inject himself. And it's like, so I ended up not, again, panicking. And it isn't, and I don't know if we'll get into the story, but it doesn't actually happen. So I shouldn't be allowed to book my own flights, because for some reason I left myself a 2-day layover in Panama instead. So I end up doing cocaine with an American girl I met in Panama. And then but again,
the way you're describing this, so I've spent some time in Latin America, but yeah. I have never I just was not running around in the circles where, the way you're describing it's like cocaine was free flowing and you could just get it anytime you wanted. Yeah, it was not my experience.
Were you in a okay, were you in like, I was in all sort of like,
no, I was working on a ship at the time.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe that could be maybe less cocaine about in the ships. And I was in all the tourist, for the first portion, it was like all the touristy areas where everybody was hanging out and everybody was just drinking and stuff, I guess, here. So it was, yeah. So especially when you're in hostels, if you want drugs, go to a hostel. Everybody knows where to get the drugs. Not everybody, but it's an easy enough place to find them. So if you're in the holiday areas, yeah, I'm sure it's pretty handy. But again, even with like the locals who I was talking to there, it seemed to be a fairly, the people who I was talking to while there taking a line of cocaine seemed to be like taking a, to anywhere else taking a beer. This is just something, Granny would take a wee bit of cocaine just to get herself going. But I don't know how representative that is from the groups of people that I was with. But yeah, it's you would imagine just that is where it's made. So it's.
And so what was the experience like? I mean, I hear euphoria. I've never done cocaine because I know if I do it one time, I will do it a million times.
No, again, that was the one. I done that once and I've not done it again. So my assumption is you'd be similar. You'd try it and enjoy it. No, it was an extremely extreme experience. I mean, with the majority of these other things, for me, it was I became very, or start thinking a lot and thinking about myself and thinking about things going on and become very what's the word I'm looking for?
Introspective.
Introspective. I became very introspective on most of the other drugs. No, not with cocaine. No introspection there. I was caught a reflection of myself in the window and thought, I am God, I am amazing. This is great. There was also the American girl. I went back to her room. There was a, one night stand. It was the way you would want to do cocaine, So,
you're the first person that's ever said that on this podcast, Buck. This is the way you'd want to do cocaine.
Here to lower the tone, Vance Crowe. That's what I'm here for. And so, yeah, no, it was. I think with something like with LSD, you take it and it's like where people give you the description of what's on television, right? You can't describe LSD unless you've taken it. You can't understand it, and nothing you've read, nothing you've seen on television. You have to take it and you have to experience it. Cocaine is more or less what you expect. It is confidence up to 100. It is a very intense feeling. Everything feels amazing to touch. You feel incredible about yourself. You feel insanely confident. Just your abilities. You're looking at everybody around you and you think how lucky they are to be in your company. You just feel fantastic, and you just want to let everybody know just how great you are. It is that. Now there is a very intense experience along with that, but it is exactly what you'd expect.
And then what's coming down off of it like? Because, I mean, I know that if I start coming down off coffee, I'll drink so much coffee, I'll make myself shake. So I can't even imagine with cocaine.
Again, the thing is, right, none of my come downs were particularly bad because I'd done, a small... Again, I obviously must have a very low tolerance as well because of the lifetime of not ever doing anything. So, whatever I done... 2 bumps, it was like that was all night, and then I was a bit tired the next day, but again, a very small amount because I would be an absolute lightweight, I'm sure.
I remember, so the only time I've ever taken like a real upper was when I was in Kenya. They have this thing called khat. And so you would take it, and it's like these stems from this plant that grows up in Somalia. And you would chew them, and it was like a mild stimulant. And I think probably the equivalent to like what it's like to chew a coca leaf. Mm-hmm. And the exact feeling you're describing is the one that I had, although probably on a lower grade. But that like my mind was just so sharp that I was able to think about things in the past I'd never thought of. I'd been able to like sit down and write and focus and concentrate. And I did that, I think, 2 times. And the second time that I did it, I was so exhausted from being up all night that it was a horrible hangover for me. But outside of that, like that, I think that experience of that hangover is what's kept me from even being slightly curious about cocaine, because that feeling that you're talking about, the confidence and the energy and the enthusiasm, I mean, I'm already way over the top. I'm already an 11. And so I don't even know. I think I'd break the scale if I did it.
Yeah, I know. I believe that. I used to train. Don't ask me how I fell into it, but I was training door-to-door salesmen. And that is an industry which is fueled by cocaine. It is, which doesn't, because it's a sort of job where you have to go to 100 doors to get five. You know, all you need is your 5 sales in the day, but you only need a knock. You have to deal with a lot of rejection, and so these guys are just disappearing off into toilets and whatever pub they're nearby, and then going off and doing door after door after door. So I could definitely understand the appeal of it, definitely understand that drive, and I could see why someone would, if you're going to get hooked on a drug, I could understand why you'd do that.
Out of all the drugs that you tried, which were the ones that you did have a pull towards? Was there any that you were like, woo, I like that a little too much?
No, it's like I haven't really. It's difficult. So mushrooms was a really, really interesting experience, and so was LSD. And again, what it does, and what I think of looking back on it, I was with a guy. It was at Stonehenge for winter solstice, in a field, wet ass from sitting in the wet grass, and uncomfortable, and cold. And I was with a fella, Greg, Tom was his brother, and he was a former drug addict. And we're sitting talking about this here, and I'd managed to get a hand of like Liberty Caps. So these are the mushrooms that just grow wild in the fields nearby. And what he said, I said, should I take it? And he says, well, are you all right in there? And he points at my forehead. And I went, yeah, I'm okay in there. And he goes, well, it should be okay, because it can only really work with what you've got going on in there. Can't put anything new in there. It can only work with that. And I went, okay, fair enough then. I take the mushrooms and I sit there. And what it does, and I was sitting looking at I was looking at the fire, and it was cracking and banging away as fires do. And I was like, that's amazing. Like that's that bit of wood is transforming into like different types of energy. That noise that I'm hearing right now is that piece of wood. That is that piece of wood that I'm hearing right now. I am seeing that fire is that bit of wood. And I was just sitting there thinking about it. It's like, started getting more and more into that thought. It's like, it's that Stonehenge. I'm like, for how many millennia have people been sitting here looking at fires? How connected am I to everything that has ever happened before? How many people have been here? And I mean, like, these are sort of like somewhat pedestrian thoughts, but at that time, these are the most profound things. And in a level that is profound, you become a little blasé towards everything because you get so used to everything around you. But I am the sort of person that every so often I'll be standing at the tap and I'll turn on the water and go, that is fucking amazing. Clean water. For the vast majority of human existence, access to clean water has been the main thing that we've been concerned about. And now I'm fit to switch on a tap. So I would be maybe inclined towards these sorts of thoughts anyway. But what it done was, with the mushrooms, it made everything very profound. But the things that I was thinking about, I think, are on a level profound. They are meaningful. Now, if you want to sit there and think about ancient aliens and about how the aliens used lasers to build Stonehenge, the mushrooms will take you down that fucking path, and you'll think these are great, really important thoughts that you're having as well. So there is sort of the danger with that, and there is sort of that consciousness, me as this complete outsider to drug culture, coming in and talking about this book and talking about this experience and the fucking like. So I in my entire life, all the drugs that I've done, there's people who I know who have done more drugs in a single night, like easily done more drugs in a single night. So it is just this sort of outsider perspective, and I have to appreciate that these experiences that I have, for the most part, most people are just looking to get really fucking smashed. They just want to get out of their head. But it's, for me, and that has been the one mushrooms I have done twice more after it. I think of everything.
And so when you think about like the time that you've spent on mushrooms, do you feel like you went to a place, whether it's deep inside you, and you pulled something back that changed your behavior or changed the way you thought about things going forward?
I want to be very. I think I want to just be like very, because there's people who make these sort of like very big claims about the potential, and I think my conclusion of the book is that under the right circumstances, with the right mindset and the right place, and these can be like useful tools into changing your perspective and to, maybe shifting you out of like negative thought patterns, and potentially they can be a useful tool. Potentially, the LSD was an extreme. The book is a portion. It was at that time a lot of the travel and stuff was still a portion of me like dealing with the breakup, and when I took the girl who I took LSD with was going through a thing, and the thing that I was going through. Well, again, if people are curious, you have to buy the book. And it was, and she, as we were like sitting in the grass, and me and her were, we clicked like very quickly because we're both things people. We like talking about things. We like talking about events. We like talking about ideas. And we had been with each other for 3 or 4 days. Had not once asked about family, not once asked about other friends. Had just talked about ideas the whole time. And we've taken the LSD and we're walking through Golden Bridge Park in San Francisco.
Oh, Golden Gate Park, yeah.
Golden Gate Park. So we're walking through that, and then suddenly she just opens up to me in this massive way. And what she tells me, and again, I'm not going to say if you can buy the book. I just think, like it always, the whole thing just connects up for me. Because for whatever reason, the book started off with, is about and I don't know why I started it just talking about connection within the universe. And what she said to me, it just, the whole, dominoes just started hitting, all the lines started connecting up. It's like, holy shit, it's all connected. And this is what LSD did for me. And it's people, this is what people often say, you just start to notice all these connections that are around you. And where I was at that particular time and where she was at that particular time, like we were the right people to be with one another doing LSD in this park at this time. And it was just a fantastic experience. And again, I sat and talked to her. And again, I'm not a person who likes talking about feelings or emotions or anything like that. I fucking hate talking about those sorts of things. But they're just sort of like, I was sitting on a statue in the park, just chatting to her. But it was as if I was talking about somebody else's problems. You're sort of like sitting outside your own body looking. I mean, not physically looking down, but it was somebody else's issues, because it's very easy to talk about somebody else's problems. Ain't not your own. They're a totally different kettle of fish. But that's what that allowed. So this was half, whatever it was. It was one half of a tiny wee piece of paper. So this was a small amount of LSD. Now, directly after that experience, a lot of negative emotions, negative feelings, and a lot of things had shifted in me. But after a time, I fell back into the normal way of things and way of thinking, right? So yeah, it as a tool for like taking me out of myself and allowing me to address some things there and then, it definitely I definitely think it helped. Now, was it the long term answer? No. But then and there, yes.
So what do you think then of this big push right now in popular culture? We're starting to see people like Michael Pollan write books about using psychedelics. We're seeing people come out and say openly they think they should be legalized, and even states themselves in the United States opening them up. It's all being done under the premise that this is allowing people to heal traumas and problems that they've had. Do you think this is a a facade, like a trick in order to get the gate open, or is this truly helping people?
I think a lot of people are full of shit. I think like largely like majority of the conversations you hear in this topic, the majority of people talking about it, the majority of like it's I remember talking to somebody like the people who are use the most of this stuff, who advocate most for it, who, and again, I'm someone who thinks legalization and regulation, I think that just makes sense. But my position coming down to my position really comes from you're funding cartels, you're funding paramilitaries, you're funding this, you're not actually doing anything, they're still widely available. It's these sort of sensible, but we're going to legalize drugs and it's going to just fix everything. Yeah, shut the hell up. I mean, like the people who do most drugs are burnouts. That's the reality. The people who are like the biggest advocates for LSD are doing what exactly? I mean, like it's people will often, I think I make the reference to this in the book as well, you know, once you start to look in to like something like LSD, the first name you'll hear is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs said that taking LSD was one of the most important experiences of his entire life. Now, Steve Jobs done LSD a handful of times. You know, it was a handful of times he done it. And for every, listen, Francis Crick as well, one of the discoverers of DNA, again, on LSD. But for every profound, worthwhile, or interesting thought had on some psychedelic, you have 100 million other people going, what even is truth? Am I even real? Are my hands even touching right now? You know, it's, can these things be useful? Yeah, in a limited potential. I don't even say yeah. Potentially, these things could have use and value and make you a more fulfilled, better rounded person. You know, but for the most part, the vast majority of people are taking them, getting smashed, having a decent time or not. And that's what's going on, the danger.
This really reminds me of my like take on marijuana, right? Like there have been a few times, like if you use THC, there are a couple of times when you're doing that, when you have some experiences or some thoughts or some conversations that are amazing, right? That whatever state you're normally in, you're not capable of doing it, at least for me. But if you get to the point where you're doing it all the time, you have this sensation of the profound, because you still have this euphoria and this like aha moment, and your brain is always trying to catch up with a pattern that it kind of sees. And I think that's kind of what you know, getting on a lot of drugs allows you to do, is it allows you to see patterns that in your ordinary brain you just can't. But the problem is that you know, the definition of genius is seeing patterns that other people can't see, and the definition of madness is seeing patterns that aren't there. And you can get into these like cycles where you think you're seeing something so profound, and when you wake up the next day or you come down off of being high, the pattern either wasn't anywhere near as beautiful as you thought it was, or for some reason you feel like, I know it was a good idea and I can only get it if I get back there, but I can't get it while I'm in my lucid state. So I'm very much with you. I think there is a ton of potential within the use of psychedelics and different types of drugs, but I think most of the time it's like getting drunk on sacramental wine.
I don't have any like strong conclusions on it. Like, so when I first started writing the book, it was full of, the war on drugs is really bad and the people who support it are really dumb, you know, and which is like so typical. And it's like, it's because they're bad and they're dumb that they have this position. And the more that maybe you grow up and you mature a bit and stuff like that, and as I'm reading them back, and went, that's actually very silly. And you take it, most of these drugs that I'm talking about, cocaine, LSD, ecstasy, these are in around 100-year-old. They're not. They're not new. They're not old. It's so societies that have never had
You
to
just
deal
said
with
two
this.
things. They're both. Are you saying they're new or they're old?
Oh, sorry, they're not. I misspoke. They're very new. They're not like they're. LSD was invented during World War One. Ecstasy, and then nobody realized it had any uses until after World War Two. Ecstasy, something similar. Cocaine. So plants have obviously been around for millennia, for a very long time. But the refining process, so people actually getting the most out of it. So they created a thing called cocoa wine, where you have to take as much of the cocaine out of the plant, mix it in with wine, you're fit to transport and sell it. So it's actually was endorsed by the Pope. And also what Coca-Cola came out of, famously. But that was only in late 1800s. And again, so people are taking that as a tonic, as a painkiller, and then after a while, they realize people are addicted to this, and then started taking it out. So there's been like this massive trial. The war on drugs is exactly what you'd expect people to do. You have nowadays where we have we've more evidence, you've more science, you have more money to spend on treatment centers and clean needle clinics, and we are lucky to be in a position where we can be more compassionate. Whereas 80 years ago they weren't in that position. And so they just seen a problem had arisen, and it's like, okay, now we need to address this. And the way you normally address these things is with a heavy hand. It's the same people who came up with the idea. It's the same ideas with prohibition, and with all the same results. But you need to sort of come at this with a mature
so for me, when I think about the legalization or the war on drugs, for me, I'm a libertarian, right? I want people to be able to do what they want to do, mostly because I want to be able to do what I want to do, and I think that I should extend that to other people. But I will say this: most of the problems that are going to come with legalization of drugs are going to come when we go from absolute prohibition, we're sending you to prison for a long, long time, to there are no rules. Because all you're going to do is open up a space where people that are not trying to do it just once or twice, but people that are saying, hey, now this opens up a gateway and I can go there and I can be a part of this drug culture. And you get a mass of people that are now, a part of this whole drug scene, and all of the problems that come along with that, which are societal, that end up causing crime, causing all sorts of other problems. And so then people are like, yeah, see, exactly, right there. That's why we should have prohibited it. So to me, it seems like that interim stage between they're illegal and now they're legal should be the one that we take slowly. Like, if we're gonna head to legalization, step it down. Don't do ding dong, let freedom ring, let's just make it all happen overnight, which is why I think Oregon is absolutely insane. They just sent a flag up all over the world to say, everybody come here because we're gonna open up the gates on this.
What have Oregon legalized?
Oh, they pretty much. So I don't want to misspeak here. They definitely opened up the doors on psychedelics, but I think they way lowered the punishment on possession of any kind of narcotics, heroin, and those kinds of things. I don't think they're legal, but I think they've just decided we're no longer going to put people in jail for it. And I think California would be the good example that, for all intents and purposes, once you've done that, they are legal.
Yeah, well, that's very similar to Portugal's system. So Portugal decriminalized everything. Portugal had a massive drug problem. Portugal was the worst in Europe. So then they went about decriminalizing everything. So if you were caught by the police with an amount that was deemed for personal use, what you got was a letter. Yeah, sorry, you have to go into doctors, and the doctors examine you, have you across the board, make sure you're not actually addicted. If you are, and if you are addicted, well, then they send you off somewhere else for treatment. And if you're just, someone who's, buying some drugs for the weekend, they send you on your way. And that's like massively helped as that in part because their drug problems completely out of control. But so I think the decriminalizing of these things, I think that's probably the right first step to make. It's my fear, and this is usually the libertarians going to disagree with it. My bigger fear with it is and I've mentioned it in the book as well, is the free market with access to these things, because we already know with like the cigarette companies are actively advertising towards children in the third world. They don't make a secret of it. They put their billboards around schools. They, when cocaine was legal, it was put into baby tooth medicine, that famous one. So if you're in a system where this is like totally unregulated with no stigma around it, why don't you put something that's deeply? I mean, like we're already at this position where we now realize that how harmful and addictive sugar is, and it's just in fucking everything. Whereas in Europe, there's tighter regulations and this stuff. It's up for.
But I would say that the other side of this, or at least one other side of this, is right now the state of Illinois has legalized marijuana. But the way that they did this was they said, we're only going to give licenses to a few people.
Yeah, bullshit, yeah.
And then what they've done is they've created an oligarchy. Whoever could figure out how to get that license now had a license to print money. And so you're choosing winners, and these are not small winners. These are winners of something that people want, millions and millions of dollars. And so I don't really want the government making choices like that. And so the trade-off that you have to have is, how do you open it up without making it so the government now gets, the ability to crown princes? Yeah.
And those people, like, that's all would have been done corruptly, no doubt. There would be, campaign funds and trips abroad and suitcases full of money and stuff like that done here and there. Probably some cousins and relations. The one of the loudest voices in the British government against the legalization of cannabis is a woman whose husband grows. So for whatever reason, an enormous amount of the Netherlands cannabis is grown in Britain. It's illegal in Britain, but you can grow it to sale to the Netherlands in Britain. And her husband owns this business, and legalization of it in Britain would basically shut them down. And she's like the loudest voice to keep it illegal. So it's again, there's always going to be problems with the system, with corruption, with incompetence, with all these sorts of things. My big issue as well, it's when I come down to it's if you hear about someone overdosing of ecstasy in Dublin or whatever, I don't care. I don't care as much as I don't care about hearing about someone having a heart attack in Wexford or whatever. If somebody died, people die. My issue comes in where I'm genuinely concerned is with the black market that it creates, with who this is the organizations that this is funding, that it's not been regulated, it's not been taxed, it's just money, an enormous amount of money that's going to criminal bodies who are putting this into weapons and street gangs and things like this. Mexico, a real fear that Mexico could become a cartel state. And we're not. And so that by itself is reason enough to go, okay, maybe we should legalize, because we're not winning this
How
way.
do you think, okay, so imagine in a scenario when you legalize it, how did they do drug education for kids in Ireland? Because here we had a thing called the DARE program. And all the DARE program did was be like, hey, if you take this drug, you'll see pink elephants. And so you don't want to do that one. That's really bad. And this other one, if you touch it even one time, you will die. You will immediately die. And like people got a little bit older and they're like, one, I'd be down with seeing some pink elephants. Like that's okay. And then the other one is, hey, my cousin did that drug. They didn't die. That was all a lie. We're not going to believe any of this. So the drug education program in the United States did, I think, virtually the exact opposite of what they planned for it to do.
There's a famous story. There's a British television show called Baker Grove, and they were over for Nancy Reagan's "Just Say No, Just Say No." That song, they were singing in it. But there's a famous story that a couple of because they're all teenagers, like, so they're on the roof of the White House smoking weed after. So yeah, no, these things don't work. I mean, like I have my Dare T-shirt sitting about in there somewhere. You know, it's like my favorite story, again mentioned in the book, is you may have heard about the Garrett. It's all, there's always a story of someone, they take LSD and for one reason or another they jump out of a window. And yeah, so everybody's heard that story. I was reading a book on LSD. It's in my kitchen. My mother's seen it, and she goes, Garrett starts telling me about a story about a girl who's seen the devil in Derry, and she jumps out the window. So this story is just prevalent, and where that story ended up coming, I think the origin of that story is there's an American game show host. His daughter had jumped out the window and killed herself, and he claimed that she'd been on LSD at the time. As it turned out, she wasn't. But then to find out she'd done it 6 months previous, and then this with the whole claims about acid flashbacks, which I think I go over. I don't believe acid flashbacks are actually a thing.
Oh my God, you're blowing my mind, because my mother used to tell this story about how she had a friend that was chased through a wooded area by a fly, and this used to happen like over and over again because she had flashbacks. So for me, that was like, oh God, I'll never do it. I never want that to happen.
Yeah, it's either it's a claim sort of. The last time I seen it was that's the LSD somehow gets stored in your spinal fluid, and that then comes out at some point or another. It's like, it's not how spines work, So no, there's a couple of I can't remember the technical name for it, but there's a couple of like studies, but they've just asked people, do you have it? And so the issue is with it, right? So I go into my basically argument. So they say to people, so you take LSD, it has this very particular feeling, right? Where the colors are all maybe a bit more intense, or sounds a bit sharper. It's a very particular feeling. But every so often, so the first time I ever smoked a joint, it was an very extreme colors, noises, could hear music, right? I remember spending time with some Hare Krishnas in Australia. I was doing a very intense chant, Hare Hare, Rama 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 Hare Hare, this over and over again. And I had like a proper out of body experience, maybe, for whatever few seconds that it was like, felt totally detached from myself. Now, I've also had other people talk about where they're, where they're having like these wee moments of just like clarity. Like my father talked about, like that went through an extremely tough time during a business closing, and was walking on the beach, and it was just as low as he'd ever been in his entire life, and he just had this click in his head, and the sea was bluer and the sky was clear, and everything was just, he just had this, and everything was okay. So just whatever happened. Now, someone could come along and go, if someone had taken LSD beforehand, they'd go, oh, it was an acid flashback. And that's all it is. It's you have a similar experience to what LSD is like, and go, oh, that's an acid flashback. So the two cases that I read about where both people were on weed at the time. They'd been smoking cannabis, but the experience was like an LSD trip rather than getting high. And so it's probably doesn't. My assumption is probably doesn't exist. I haven't seen anything to suggest to me that it does. And it sort of just helps as a bit of like anti-drug propaganda to tell people, oh, you could be up a ladder and you'll have a flashback and you'll fall off. I doubt.
What is your experience now? You started out as a teetotaler, and then you do this adventure on drugs. Did you make the decision you want to go back to being a teetotaler, or
I might.
you?
I have I don't do anything. I don't drink. I like so I drank I think it was 5 times I've been drunk. Because anytime I've drank, I've got drunk, because that was sort of the reason of doing it. And 2 of those occasions were not good, and I've never drank again, and I've no real. Like if you
What
like,
was
I am.
not good about them?
Let's not talk about that.
You can't come on a podcast and talk about your adventure in drugs and then tell us.
No, it was sad. No. If it was like, oh, I wrecked this thing and I've gone to a fight and I threw a boy off a building. If it was something like that, no, it's just sad, and I'm not I'm just not get into it. But it just was a fairly lame, negative, which I've seen a million times before. People, standing talking to themselves and getting worked up, or somebody sitting crying because they're drunk or vomiting or whatever. And it's like, it doesn't look worth it. And I'm already, when I'm out, I'm, depending on the crowd, I'm maybe the loudest person there. And, I'm fairly outgoing, and I'm happy enough to be up dancing and talking to ones. And, that's not an issue for me. I think not drinking as a teenager made me have to, get good at that. That wasn't not being good at it wasn't an option for me. I couldn't just drink some confidence into myself. So it doesn't really affect me. It was fun experience. It was a fun experience. What I found about alcohol more than anything isn't it, and it really clicked with me, was on nights out, talking to drunk people. It's the most horrifyingly boring thing imaginable. So there was one French guy. I was sitting chatting to him, and he started telling me about his flight from here to there, and he got to Germany, and then they had to get the bus, and then they're going to go here, and they have to get in another bus here, and then they're getting a flight, and that flight got delayed, and then this here and this, and he just kept going on and on. And normally, while sober, sitting listening to that sort of conversation, I'd be sitting there going, Jesus, wouldn't it be great if I could just die? But while drunk, you're sitting there going, a bus for 3 hours? My God, I've never heard the likes of that. A 3-hour bus ride? Jesus Christ, fantastic. My God. This incredibly monotonous, boring bullshit becomes riveting, becomes interesting, becomes great. You just want to hear more of it. And so it's like, I can see the appeal, where I can definitely see the appeal of alcohol in that way, because it's just sort of, it's a social, more than just a social lubricant. It just makes, whereas I'm like quite often just get very bored in these places very quickly, where I can see how you can be very happy just sitting there and very content, getting a bit drunk and talking shit whenever you can. So but overall, it's not something that I'm particularly interested in doing. It's the only one that I am curious about, because I would like to try DMT at some point. I would like to try ayahuasca at some point. So
we all. So that brings up a good point. Like you're talking about drugs that you could listen to Joe Rogan, who's very popular. People love him, and he tells you, "Oh, do this. There's no downside to it. It's fine." But when you really think about it, you're messing around with the circuitry that makes you you. Yeah. So when you think about doing that and taking these, you've already taken some drugs that could have altered the wiring in your brain. Are you worried about that at all? Are you worried about losing who Buck is?
No, it's like it's they're all gone. I mean, the chemicals are all now flushed out, and I think to make actual serious change, you would need to do like some damage or whatever, or these would need to be. With ayahuasca, that's an extremely intense experience, but for like long-term beneficial change, you need to like regularly, regularly, whatever, a few times a year, you need to keep going back and doing this and keep working on yourself and keep doing all these things. And so I doubt. Here's the thing. I think nothing has changed my mindset more, has changed the chemistry of my brain more than lifting weights. And more than any of those things possibly could have, that regularly going in, getting those endorphin hits, whatever other chemical changes are happening. I mean, like it lifted my mood, it changed me more than any of these things did or potentially could have. And so there's, I am a different person from when I started lifting weights than before I lifted weights. So it's like, yeah, so the worst changes that I am a different person. So I mean, like, so you're also constantly changing as well and maturing, and your brain chemistry is always shifting.
So you went on this adventure at Heartbreak, which sounds like the beginning of a hero's journey. Yeah. Did you come out on the other side a better man? Are you, a better mate for a woman? Are you better prepared to handle heartbreak?
So this is when I started like doing this. This is what you want. Ideally, you want to do. You want to have it as a hero's journey, and you want to come out a better person at the end. And I had that. I whatever. There's 65,000 words in that book. I probably read 250, and deleting and changing and coming back and but when it came down to it, when I'm very glad I didn't release the book years ago. I'm glad that there was that time of like changing and looking back and stuff on it, because I went away and had done some drugs and had some interesting experiences, and that's what happened. There wasn't a hero's journey. I didn't, come out better. I didn't know there was no, call, it was a bit of a cult adventure, but no, I done some drugs. I had some interesting experiences. Maybe there were some shifts. Maybe there were some changes. But again, I came back because I was, and while the drugs definitely helped in those moments and for a little while, these things aren't going to fix you. Now, maybe as a part of some small part of a bigger journey, maybe, but they aren't going to fix you. That's just the reality, and that's not just from my experiences. The people who will tend to tell you, that's who will make all the big claims about, what's DMT can do, what's cannabis can do. They tend to be full of shit, and it's the people who you do look at and go, oh, that is a worthwhile, useful, contributing person. If they're talking about it, they've done it occasionally. It has been a small thing. They've had an experience and then they've went on to it. But there's Joe Rogan talks about, smoking weed to help him with his comedy. Joe Rogan's comedy's trash. Now, I love his podcast and everything. I like the conversations, but as someone who really loves stand-up comedy, Joe Rogan's stand-up comedy is, even by like the bad American stand-up comedy standards, is really, really bad. If someone got on an open mic stand and went, I'm so high right now, don't you just love weed? They would get stared at. He has a built-in fan base. People like him. There's certain people who laugh at whatever he says, but he's just killing my chances of getting Rogan. But he's not a great stand-up comedian. That's just the reality. And so him talking about smoking weed to help him loosen up and get better at this, it's like, yeah, it probably sounds about right.
Man, that's like sacrilege in the world of podcasting. But I, to be totally candid, I had never actually thought about it. I went to one of his comedy shows, and it was a good experience. I enjoyed myself, but it was much more about seeing a guy that I think is world class at many things, but he was definitely not at the Dave Chappelle level of comedy, where like anything that comes out strikes you as like, I would never have thought of that. I think he's very quick-witted. I think he knows how to rib and all of those things, but I would agree with that assessment. And I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that, Buck.
Yeah, no, so I'm just here to spit truth. That's what I'm all about.
So what are you gonna? You've published this book. How's it going? I mean, you've been all over the world talking about this thing.
So I know it's moving a unit at a time. trying to sell it. If I want to, I've decided I'm going to start working on the next book. I'm just going to do that, regardless of how this sells or how this goes.
And what is the next book?
Do I talk about the next book before I even started this one yet? The next book is called All I Care About Is Sex and Violence. So originally, so you think drugs, and I thought, oh, you do a trilogy, it'd be so sex, drugs, and violence, and sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever, but sex, drugs, and violence. And then as I'm sort of like thinking about this topic, there's actually a song by a rapper called Dizzy Rascal, and there's a lyric in it, and all I care about is sex and violence. And so that came to me. But it is what I want to do in the next, right now, I'm pretty fat from lockdown, haven't been in a gym in months, haven't got any sort of like targets or anything to go to, but what I've decided to do for this is I'm going to do an MMA fight. So I'm going to set up and I'm also set up I have to find a wife as well this year, so that's one of my other targets. So it's going to be about I'm not totally sure what the book's about, but it's going to be that journey to that there. It's going to be
have you seen, speaking of sex that you're talking about, have you seen that there is a new movie, like I think it's actually a mini series called There's No I in Threesome? No?
There? What's that? No,
yeah,
what is it in Netflix?
It's supposed
original?
to be a documentary about a guy who's engaged to a woman, and then they decide they're going to have a polyamorous relationship, meaning they keep each other's relationship at the highest point, but that they allow the other one to have like sexual relationships with other people. And supposedly this is like their documentary journty of this. I was so repelled by this that it was like watching a car wreck, right? Like I was like, this will never work. And I watched the previews of it, and I think we're headed into a very unusual time in our culture where, because religion has fallen away, because people don't believe in the state, because they think like, hey, Dare told me that drug would kill me and it didn't. I think that people are going to be testing the boundaries. And I think the challenge of writing anything about sex right now is that there are people willing to go really far to talk about this subject.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm not getting into any of this at the moment, but it's where you can sort of, I'm fairly skeptical about any of this claims about polyamorous relationships. Just that, okay, right? So human beings, just as we are, women have sex when they want, men have sex when they can. So, the joke throughout the book is me constantly trying to pick up women, and I mean, like, the vast majority of it's rejection, which is just which is just the way it is. Women don't have that issue. Like, I was chatting with a feminist friend, and she was claiming that this whole idea that men have a higher sex drive than women. Oh, this is it's this patriarchal, this made up, all of this. And I said, okay, let's run an experiment. We're going to go out onto the street, and you're going to offer to have sex with men. And what we'll do is we'll count how many seconds it takes for one man to say yes. And I will do the same thing at the other side of the road, and we will count how many seconds it takes before the police are called. And so when you're getting into like one of these polyamorous relationships, it's going to be very one-sided. It's going to be very, very one-sided, because it's going to be much, much easier for one person than it is going to be for the other, which is already going to start an amount of division and jealousy and bitterness, because the reality is relationships are difficult. And so now you're going to add in this new component into it. It's going to complicate and make things messy. I think Jordan Peterson referred to it as a adolescent daydream. And I was like, I would lean heavily towards that. I'd say it's so the relationships that I do know about, where I was like, when I'm traveling about and meeting these people, it's like when it turns out, he's just really in a cucked relationship. she's having sex with other people. And
I mean, that's almost exactly what I thought, and that's why I was saying that the finding that preview for that show was like a train wreck, and I was total clickbaited. Like, they got me because I went and watched as many of the previews as I could, because I was like, what idiot would the guy would be like, yeah, I think this is a great idea, and not only for your example, but like for the like, I don't know, like having one of the best parts about marriage is that you can reach a point where you have so much trust that you don't need to have jealousy. And removing jealousy from your life removes an entire huge block of adolescent chaos in your life, where you're thinking about what somebody else is thinking about you and how you can reciprocate, and should you have power dynamics, and like, when you get married, if you get married to the right person, that stuff all goes away. You have new problems, but you're transcended to a different level. So when this preview was about this guy, like, oh, we're about to get married and we're going to do this to like see how it can benefit our relationship, I was like, you idiot. You're giving up the very best thing that you have for what? Like, why get married at all?
Yeah, I know, but I think a lot of this stuff it's where you tend to find where people who are like, okay, right, so we went back in a generation, people are very conservative. Now they couldn't explain, and this is sort of what happened me ever being the edgy internet atheist or whatever in a teenager, because conservative people cannot defend their positions. They don't know why they believe. It's just always worked. These positions have always worked, and that's why I'm doing them. And they can't explain why. They don't know what's about them.
Yeah, tradition is the answers to questions that we've even forgotten the questions, right?
Yes.
Like, we don't know why they work. We just do this tradition, and by the way, then our lives succeed.
Yeah. You the groups that adopt these beliefs and practices survive, and the groups that don't survive. And so so it is. The book is. So the next book is, because it's a lot about evolutionary psychology, because it's. I think you've within the certain groups, it's an unpopular idea, but these are the same sort of people who would have been arguing against creationists, arguing against religious people, and claiming that evolution is true. But then once it comes to psychology, evolution isn't true. No, but psychology, obviously it evolved. Like, clearly it evolved. Where else did it come from? And so a large portion of, if we could call it a depression, you take even the obesity epidemic. The obesity epidemic can only be understood from looking at it as from the perspective of evolution. It's like, oh, we have evolved to desire sugar, to like sugar, and now we're completely, this thing that's very rare, that we very little access to, and now we're completely surrounded with it. We are evolved to live in areas with live in periods of scarcity where food's going to run out, so when it's abundant, you take advantage of that. And now we're in the time of plenty, and it's backfiring. America's 2 generations away from being unable to defend itself because the population will be too fat. So that can only be understood. And so, like, how many more other, everything from depression to anxiety to whatever can only be understood if you look at it from the perspective of evolution. All right, well, these traits. So depression exists for a reason. It's not a bad thing. It's not something. It's there to tell you. It's again, like, these are things that obviously be more complicated. And there's obviously some people who are going to have actual issues with brain chemistry. It's thrown around too much, but this is something that's there for a reason.
Yeah, I think that goes along. Anxiety is one of those things that I talk about. Anxiety is your brain saying something is really wrong and you need to fix it. And when you go around saying we should fix the symptoms, you shouldn't be anxious, as opposed to saying, hey, your psyche is telling you that you're doing something wrong and you need to address it. And by the way, the reason that it takes your psyche is because you don't want to face it. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're exactly right. Like, you really don't know And you've got to have an open society where you don't say, hey, the traditions that we had in the past, we always have to adhere to. You have to have people pushing the boundaries.
Yeah.
But
you
be careful of
you're
being the person that opens
yeah.
that door. And I think this relates to you in your book. Like in the case of you saying, I'm going to open the door to these drugs, like you really did take a chance there, because you could have been that guy that was on the hostel stairs injecting heroin into his in between his toes.
Yeah, there's a Dr. Carl. I've mentioned this to you before we started recording, but I can't remember his name. I think it's Dr. Carl Hart. But he is a drug expert. He's written several books on the topic, but he has talked out how he's a recreational drug user. He's a recreational heroin user. So, and this is actually a lot more common within the medical field. So the argument that they have is that, these are professional people. They're, they're not short of money. They have access to, they know how to use a needle. They have access to high quality narcotics, so they're not getting rubbish. They do it occasionally. They do it occasionally with a group of other people who they trust and who they work with, and who also can use needles and have access to high quality narcotics. And it's safe in that scenario. It's safe until it isn't. And this is sort of the issue. It's none of it's that good. It's because everything's at the end of the day is risk and reward, and is that risk, even as small as you think it is, worth it for the the potential fallout? So and again, he's a tenured professor. He doesn't really have any worries. Doesn't really have it's a he's a very safe job and a very I'd say easy. I don't know exactly what he does, but from my experience of tenured people, it doesn't tend to be too strenuous. So maybe he has a lifestyle where he can get away with recreational heroin use, and it's. But your other issue is, I normally what they talk about is what was called him again? What's Christopher Hitchens' brother called again? Forgot his
Peter
name.
Hitchens.
Peter Hitchens wrote, and again, it's where my position has changed so much, because when I read his book, The War That Never Was, I laughed the whole way through it. I thought, what a silly book. And now reading over it again, I'm like, actually, he's making a lot of fair points. Because he's talking about like these upper middle class, secure mortgage paid off or paying off their mortgage, educated people talking about their drug use. It should be legalized because I have a joint at the weekend, blah, blah, blah. And it's all fair and well. But the reality is the majority of drugs are being taken by poor people. The majority of the drugs are being taken by people who are not in secure positions. They're being taken by people who probably don't need to be spending that money there, who probably is really negative to their overall lifestyle. So you have this, this group of, you've used terminology to describe the away people. What do they call again? The type of person who goes away.
Oh, the anywhere people.
Anywhere people. So you have these anywhere people who are like, who are, we need to, well, these drugs are fine for me, so it should be fine for everybody. So all the laws and all the legislation, all the rules, it should be built to suit me. Don't think about it. And again, the idea that there's other people with different experiences, different mindsets, different values, different tolerances, that these people are somehow different than them is not, that couldn't be right. So the legislation needs to fit me and my group of friends. And so there is that danger, and I have to appreciate while I'm not educated by any means, I am in a sort of a privileged position where I'm, secure and I'm in a decent job, and I don't have too many pressures or struggles. And my reasons for doing these things is maybe different than another person's reason for doing them. So, and I am throughout the book very cautious, and even when I have those like good experience, I think in nearly every chapter I'm like, yeah, but remember that bad thing that happened. So I don't want to. And that only came later on in the book, because when I first wrote the book, it was that sort of like saying, like, now consider sort of cringy, just the war on drugs is really dumb position, but
Well, Buck, you are a fun adventurer, and you've definitely enticed me. I'm interested in getting your book. So if people wanted to get your book, where would they do it, and how would they find you out on the internet?
If you look up, I can never remember this. It's either that Buck Gay, so that THAT Buck GUY on Twitter. Adventures on Drugs in Amazon or in other online bookshops. Go buy it there. So there's the two things. Go buy several copies, backup copies for your friends, your family.
Well, man, congratulations on writing a book. That is always an accomplishment, and it is one that sounds intriguing and something that you can't hear elsewhere. So, man, good luck to you on selling the books, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Vance.